Well, hello, and welcome to the final HMEI Faculty Seminar for 2021. We made it through our first hybrid semester, assuming nothing surprising today. And today we have the pleasure of Sigrid Adriaenssens giving us a presentation on building forms that adapt to the environment. Sigrid is an associate professor in civil environmental engineering and the director of the program in mechanics, materials, and structures, which doesn't leave much for anyone else, I guess. Anyway, Sigrid's research focuses on lightweight surface systems and how they can be optimized for extreme structural and environmental loading. Sigrid works on a variety of projects and has received a number of awards and honors. But I think one that I think ties into both today's presentation and sort of the spirit of HMEI is the George Winter Award from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And this award, for those of you who do not know, it is awarded to someone once a year who best typifies the late Dr. George Winter's humanistic approach to his profession. That is an equal concern for matters technical and social, for art as well as science, for soul as well as intellect. So thank you, Sigrid. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Thank you, Gabe, for that introduction, and welcome everybody for coming to listen to my work on, I'm going to talk about building forms that adapt to the natural environment. I also have an entire talk about building forms that do not necessarily adapt to the natural environment. But my business is in the construction industry, and the construction industry is a very wasteful industry, and actually an industry that is very relevant. If you walk around campus, you might see that there are many construction projects going on. We have the parking garages going up, the art museum being pulled down, and the new residential colleges being constructed across Pofield. And what you see here is two images from a construction site, one from 1936 and the other one from 2021. And what you can see is that not very much has changed, except for maybe that people are now wearing hard hats on site. And that then comes against other numbers. By 2050, there will be another 2.1 billion people on Earth, and put next to that the construction productivity that has been falling, especially in the United States, and especially also compared to other industries. And as we are increasing more and more people in North America, for example, it's estimated that we will need 65% more floor space. And that then all comes, of course, in the context of climate change challenges. The construction industry is responsible for 30% of the CO2 emissions. In 2017, China placed a 4-month ban on construction projects to reduce pollution. But not only is the construction industry contributing to CO2 emissions, we also have to deal with the consequences of it. So you might have been here in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy damaged a lot of properties along the seashore. It was estimated then that this resulted in $70 billion economic damages, and then of course also huge social losses. So we also have to deal with more frequent and higher kind of loads that come onto civil structures like houses. We also have a challenge of natural resources. So today, or in 2020, in 1 year, we pour about 10 billion tons of concrete. It is projected that in 2050, this will be 60 billion tons. And a key ingredient of concrete is sand, which you might think as being a commodity, but actually it's predicted that sand will not be economically available in the next 30 years. And then also, I can keep on going on, but this is the last one. The construction industry is a very wasteful industry, so it's estimated that 29% of the landfills in the United States are filled with construction waste. So basically, what happens is when we build a building, or for example, when we build shell structures, that's kind of what my expertise is in, we first build this form out of wood or timber, then we cast the concrete on top, then we take the formwork away, all that formwork ends up in the landfill. So it is, I think, very clear that we need to change what we design for, how we design it, and how we build it. And in my research, and also actually my practice before I joined academia, I focused very much on using slender structural surfaces. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. So that those are shells and membranes and networks. And I apply them at different scales, going from macro scale, adaptive shading modules, which I will talk about today, as well as large scale storm surge barriers. We need to design for extreme loading. Extreme loading has always been there, but with climate change, this is becoming more unpredictable and more frequent and more intense. How we design, there is a traditional way of designing in civil engineering skill is to use a lot of materials, to use a lot of mass. What I'm proposing is actually to use geometry and mechanics to our advantage, to carry heavy loads, to adapt to the environment. And then finally, we're also going to need to change how we build, meaning that we want to build without using so much material in the process. I will not talk about this last one, but actually this last one refers to a branch of my research where I'm very interested in constructions that can be built without formwork, and I'm working with people in robotics to look at the robotic fabrication of buildings without formwork. Of course, the idea of using form is not totally new. Throughout history, people have been using form. If you look on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have weight. Notice that that's a logarithmic scale. And totally at the top, there are, of course, the pyramids, which were solid and weigh a lot per square meter. But if we make our way all the way down, we go past the domes, for example, the Hagia Sophia, the Gothic vaults, all these kind of structures used form as opposed to mass to span large distances and carry loads down to the foundations. And if we look in the last century and today, we see that actually some of the structures that are shown here weigh very little. You see that some of the structures are actually below 1 kilonewton per meter squared. And those are the structures that I'm working in. So these structures are so lightweight that, and use therefore so little materials, and so therefore have a much smaller carbon footprint. They're so lightweight that if they are not designed well, the wind could actually lift them up and put them somewhere else. Now, enough time explaining. I'm going to show a project that I worked on before I joined academia, and this is the Dutch Marine Museum. So before joining academia, I worked in practice, and we were invited to design a roof over this building. So this is a 16th century building. It used, 17th century building, used to be a gunpowder house. So the Dutch would, go here with their ships, pick up the gunpowder, and then go and explore the world. After that was not relevant anymore, it became a prison. And after that, it became a museum that kind of celebrates the Dutch, as a seafaring nation, their skills in making maps, in making boats, etc., etc. Now, that building, if you look at it from the top, so this is a plan view, it's actually not one building, it's 4 buildings, and it has an internal courtyard that is open to the elements, and it is made out of masonry. So it was made out of stones. And so the design competition was to design a roof over this courtyard. The courtyard spans about 90 feet, or that is 30 meters. Now, inside the museum, we found many maps. For example, this map here is a map from the 16th century showing windroses. So this is a map of what the Dutch thought the world looked like. Some parts are correct, some parts are not so correct. But the other interesting thing is that you have this kind of geometric pattern on there. These are actually the lines that the Dutch thought that the wind was blowing. So they would sail along these lines, a little bit like a GPS system, to navigate the world. We were interested in this geometric pattern and wondered whether we could turn that into a roof. Now, if you know anything about mechanics, you know that you cannot actually span 90 feet or 30 meters with flat beams, if we imagine this to be a beam system covered with glass. So we imagined that this would have to be some kind of curved cupola. We end up with a system that is totally in compression and makes very efficient use of the materials. So here you have, that pattern now put onto the courtyard. So it's basically a steel grid shell that is clad with planar glass plates. And the techniques that we use, what you see at the top is again the pattern that we extracted from the map. And then we use, this is right after my PhD, we used some of the algorithms that I had developed during my PhD studies to form a hanging chain model. If you do a hanging chain model, you end up with a form that's totally in tension. If you invert it, you end up with a cupola that is totally in compression. And so that's a very efficient way to load shells, in this case grid shells, and that allows the members to be really, really thin. So many years forward, the design competition was won, the structure was built. Here you see it from a bird's eye view. As you see, it's an historic building, so the roof is not allowed to come above the I don't know what the word is, the top of the roof of the museum anymore, right? When you go inside and you lie on your back, which I have actually done, this is what it looks like. So this actually looks like the map that you saw before. You see how the steel members are very, very thin, right? That's allowed, or that was enabled by the form finding techniques. And then the other thing that we did is at the nodes we inserted LED lights, so that at night it looks like this, kind of showing or kind of reminding you of a starry night when you're on the ship, maybe navigating your way around the world. When I was working on this structure, I realized that these kind of structures are really good. These kind of shells, membranes, in this case grid shells, because they are indeterminate structures. That means that if some part goes missing because there is a blast or there's a fracture somewhere, the forces will actually find different load paths. So in that way it's very good. It has shell behavior because of the form finding techniques that we use. That means that in this case they're all actually loaded. That means that we can actually use very little material. You can see it's a very lightweight dome. And finally, also I realized that because of the curved form, it actually becomes, in this case, quite stiff, which is also a quality that you would want, for example, in a glass grid shell roof. Now, just to put this a little bit in context for architectural and civil scale projects, there are some differences with projects in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, and I want to point them out because these challenges put constraints on what is possible. First of all, spatial scale. So the projects that I do I've put there 10 to 100 meters, but really they're from 1 meter all the way up to 1,000 meters. And as you know, things just don't scale up in size, right? It's an important reminder there, Galileo Galilei, who said, if you scale up a bone, it doesn't just become bigger in all directions, right? Also temporal scale. So the things that we design have to last at least for 50 years, sometimes 200 years or 2,000 years. That means that the materials that we use have to be durable throughout that time. And also the things that we design, we have to design for the loading that we can envisage that these things are going to take. And the example here is of course the Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. This dome, beautiful dome, I've done another project on this one, how this was constructed without formwork, but this dome here has resisted, first of all, the time, but also earthquakes, very high loading. And then, of course, we are, and I already mentioned that, restricted at the civil architectural scale with the materials that we can use because they have to last for such a long time. Then there are some challenges in loading, right? In recent years, I've become very interested in extreme loading, and some of these kind of loadings are have always been there, like earthquakes, right? But some kinds of loading are becoming more frequent and more intense. And extreme loading means that you get loading over a quite short period of time. But the value or the intensity is very, very high. And and these kind of slender surfaces actually lend themselves very well to cope with these kind of loadings because the surfaces, they are continuous and they're spreading the load throughout the surface. So today I'm going to talk about 3 projects where we use slender surfaces where we can achieve properties that we can normally not achieve with structural systems, right? So I'm going to talk about systems that actually adapt themselves, that change as a function of the loading that comes onto it. Normally when you design in architecture or civil engineering, for example, if you would design this auditorium here, you wouldn't want your roof to deflect, you wouldn't want your floors to deflect, you wouldn't want your columns to slightly buckle. But I think there is a whole range of applications at the civil architectural scale that actually benefit from deforming and kind of adapting to the loads, and in this case, extreme loads that are coming onto it. So I'm going to talk about surfaces that change their shape and amplify motion. I'm going to talk about surfaces that actually tune their stiffness, and I'm going to talk about 2 examples like that. So I'm going to talk about the applications now. The first one, and this is a rendering, this is not a real picture. This is a rendering of a storm surge barrier that I propose in Rockaway Peninsula, which would keep people and property safe from storm surges. What is new here is that these storm surge barriers would be deployable, so they would only be there when there are storm surges coming. I'm also going to talk about flexible nets. These nets, there are different applications for where these nets can keep people safe, and I'm going to talk about that. And finally, I'm going to talk about adaptive building facades, so basically facades that can open and close as a function of the lighting levels outside as well as the temperature or the outside temperature. And basically these adaptive building facades serve as filters to kind of control the impact of the external environment on the internal environment. So I'm first going to talk actually about this last project, the adaptive shading facades. And again, this is a rendering of an imaginary museum in Marfa, Texas. So first of all, we do not, so facades or walls are really filters between the external environment and the internal environment. And sometimes we might want different conditions. So for example, on here, this is a facade where the shells are more open. That might be maybe conference rooms. Where the shells are more closed, maybe those are projection rooms, or would be a room where they're giving a presentation like this one here, right? So we might want to change the opacity of the facade as a function of the architectural program behind the facade, or we might just want to control it in terms of the lighting and the temperature conditions outside. So this is how this could be imagined at the nighttime, and maybe this is at the lunchtime, right, where the facade is mostly closed. It has been shown, I've not shown this, but it has been shown that adaptive building facades can save up to 40% of building operation energy. Most building facades, you might not have seen many, but most building facades, like for example, there is one very famous one in the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, work with rigid body motion. So for example, they work like the lens of an old-fashioned camera. So they will have ball bearings. So all the elements will be rigid, and you have, for example, ball bearings that make the thing open, the iris open and close. This is very costly to maintain, and therefore that is one of the reasons why it has been suggested that these adaptive facades have not been used a lot. So we wanted to get inspiration of how can we distill mechanisms that are fast, that we can cause repeatable movements, and that we can upscale to the large scale. And we started looking at plants. We worked together with a botanist who identified how plants move. Now, you might think that plants don't move. For example, if you think about a cactus, that doesn't really seem to move, but a sunflower does definitely move. Now, we identified that there's actually 5 strategies in plants. The first one is differential expansion. So basically, and I know there are like biologists in the audience, so excuse my maybe jargon. But so the first one is differential expansion, where you have different cells, and then some of the cells will start swelling, a bit like in a bimetal, where you have 2 metals with different coefficient of thermal expansion. One will, become larger, and therefore, in this case, bend structure, right? That's differential expansion. Another one is the mechanics one, where you have very slender members. This is the bird of paradise flower, where you have very slender elements. When the birds go and sit on this element will actually twist or rotate. So that's another strategy. Another strategy is the one that is used in pine cones that open and close due to humidity. The reason why that happens is because they have, in their little arms, they have different layers of fibers. And so if you start orienting fibers in different directions, and then you change something, like you change, for example, the humidity, they will either take on a bending action or twisting action. I'm going to skip the shell geometry because I'm going to come back to that. The last one is the release of elastic energy, where something deforms or shrinks so much that eventually in this case, there's a fracture of the membrane, which then expulses the seed. We were most interested in the shape-shifting strategy that we find in the Venus flytrap. We're all familiar with that. So basically what you have there is you have 2 shells that are open. When the plant senses that there is a prey there, it will send a trigger, and basically some of the cells will swell and the other ones will not swell. And as a consequence of that, you will get like a snap-through buckling of the shell, and it will capture the element. Now, we were interested in that because, not so much in the Venus flytrap, because that's a very fast movement, the snap-through buckling, but we were interested in plants that use geometries to kind of achieve, we were interested in more controllable, not so much on-off, but like a movement that you can kind of control. And we came across this plant here on the left-hand side. It's the Stylidium graminifolium, which is a flower that occurs in Australia. On the left-hand side, you see a cut-through. You see the red part, which we call the bend, which is the active part, and then the blue part is the part that actually doesn't deform. The red part or the pink part is actually the part that will deform, and it will, by a small deformation in the red part, actually this blue part kind of moves up, and when there's a bee around, it will deposit pollen on the bee and pollination will happen. So we were very interested in that red part, which, when we looked at it, has this kind of anticlastic geometry. And we built there a small prototype. You see that, it is doubly curved, but if you press on it just a little bit, this thing opens wide. You get a large change of curvature with very little input. And that's what we're interested in, these adaptive facades. We're interested in shapes that change a lot, dynamically amplified by just actuating it a little bit. So we started then imagining how could we interpret this geometry and this mechanics for a shading device, and you see it here on the right-hand side. So it's part of a torus, right? We have inverted the colors, but the blue part is here, the active part. So the blue part can be manipulated, and the red part will just follow along. The way that we imagine that we manipulate the blue part, so we want both, for a shading device, you want both bending and twisting twisting action is with two smart memory alloy wires that run across, and when they both contract, it will lift up, and when one only contracts, you will actually get a twisting motion. So we were interested in geometries that deform through bending, not so much through membrane action, but because that actually requires a lot of energy. And we were helped in our search for forms by something that Lord Raleigh had said in 88, that you can actually find these shapes by looking at eigenmodes. So we investigated many, many different shapes and studied their eigenmodes to see how these systems would like to prefer. And we saw that indeed the internal 1/4 of a torus is actually the geometry that we found in the plant is actually really good for deforming very largely using very little energy. So we did many parametric studies to identify the right two radii, right, because this shape is defined by two radii. And we also carried out some other studies to see that, you know, when we deform this, do we mostly get bending action or membrane action? And actually we get a lot of, mostly we got a lot of bending action, which is very beneficial because then your thing will actually deform a lot. And what you see here is on the left-hand side, a finite element analysis showing how this thing, by contracting in one direction, it will twist. By contracting the two wires, it will actually bend. We were very lucky to get from the university funding to develop this as a shading device. So it's a new shading device technology, but actually thinking a little bit larger, this could also be an actuator, that soft actuator that allows for both twisting and bending. Okay, and here are some renderings of what this would look like if you had an imaginary office in New York when it's fully open. This is with the twisted motion. This is with the bend motion. What we learned also from shading devices is that actually not only do you want to control the temperature on the inside and the lighting levels on the inside, but also you want to allow the user of the space to have a good view outside. And I have not discussed this, but actually we did a whole optimization study to determine what angles of twist and what bending do we want in order to optimize the temperature and the lighting levels inside an office. Okay, this is when it's half open, and this is when it's closed at night. Again, these are renderings, these are not real pictures. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about nets because this project is not yet fully finished, but I find it very interesting, and a lot of people have shown interest about it. So a couple of years ago, I received a phone call from Professor Adi from the island of Réunion, which is next to Madagascar, and he had read that I can model membranes and nets, and he talked about how in Réunion they were having a big problem. Réunion is a very beautiful island that mostly gets its tourism from surfers, and there had been a number of shark attacks in the surf area. So the local government had decided to install these shark barrier nets in the wave break zone. So you see here a plan view of one beach, Boucancano, near Saint Paul, which is the capital of Réunion. And this is the net that they had installed. So you have anchor chains which are anchored to the floor. This in itself is already difficult, right? Like anchoring a floor, anchoring this to a floor is difficult. Then you have buoys, then you have polypropylene nets, and then you have upper buoys. This is the net that they had installed. I'm showing you this because I'm showing this in the context of shark attacks, but actually, underwater nets I think have much potential also for cultivating all kinds of cultivation of, for example, mussels and oysters, etc., etc. What they had found, well, first of all, the installation of these nets was super expensive, and you might think, well, those are all materials that you can buy in Home Depot. I don't really see how that's expensive, but actually the installation of these nets under the water requires scuba divers, which is super expensive. Secondly, these nets were inspected on a daily basis because scuba divers have to go and check whether there's openings in the net, yes or no. Unfortunately, so it costed millions, this project. After 4 months, the nets were broken. The first thing that I thought was, well, the sharks have eaten it, but that is actually not the case. So it was not the sharks nibbling on the nets. Also, you will see the mesh size is 40 centimeters, so that the turtles can go through. When I looked at these nets, I thought, wow, they are really not the wrong shape, because they are what they are, but they are the wrong topology, which means they are, the way that these threads are oriented is just the wrong direction. And here okay, I'm just gonna have to talk over the sound of the scuba diver, but you get an idea there of what these nets are subjected to. I don't know if somebody can switch off the sound. So this is on a normal day. This is not on a storm surge day. This is not on a cyclone day. These nets are in the wave plane. So it's really like they are in a washing machine, right? It's that kind of level of activity going on. And so my intuition was like, okay, so the design on the left-hand side, that's the one that they installed. I don't think that's working very well. So what we did is we modeled a number of different net topologies, right? So I'm not working with form, but I'm working with topology. We looked at a hexagonal net, we looked at all kinds of different nets, and then of course we made these models, which are fluid structure interaction models of waves acting on these nets. We looked at what if the waves come frontal, what if they come sideways, and this is the graph. And if you can't really read the graph because it's tiny font, one thing you will see is that there's one blue one performing very badly. Well, that's that one. That's the orthogonal one. That's the one that they constructed, right? And all the other ones kind of behave better. The reason for that, as you can imagine, in its original form, that net cannot really extend a lot. When the water level goes up because of the cyclone or because of the wave, it cannot really, it's already fully tensioned, right? So it cannot really extend a lot. So, if this was a metamaterial, you would say that wouldn't really have a very good Poisson's ratio. And so the stresses in this net is much, much higher than, for example, in this net here, which is an hexagonal net, where the stresses will be much, much lower, and it can also extend much higher. Now, these stresses that are occurring in there are not they are not breaking the net, but the fatigue, which means like repeated cycling through stress levels actually, and then if you also imagine that there's like sand grains between the polypropylene mesh, this makes that these nets actually fail very, very quickly. So I'm showing this because I think this is interesting, how these structures now, not through form but through topology, can interact with the environment. I've also been working, and this is slightly different, but it's related to it, I've been working on a framework to see how we can use machine learning for if we have a desired kind of behavior that we want or mechanical response that we want, how can we design structures like these cellular structures, how can we optimize the topology so that we get a specific behavior. And the next slide actually maybe is not so much related to the environment, but it does relate to how these structures actually really interact with external loading, in this case not waves, but in this case dancers. So this is a project I'm currently still working on with Rebecca Lazier and Janet Echoman. We're looking at how nets interact with dynamic loading. We're seeing some very interesting things there, that actually these nets, as you load them more, stiffen more, so they also become more stiff, and this is maybe something that we could leverage for certain civil or architectural applications. Okay, I'm gonna go to my last project now, coming back to how we deal with climate change. So after Sandy, many coastal communities restored their boardwalk to the way it was, or they constructed seawalls like this, Some of them look like this with lots of stones. Some of them are really walls, concrete walls, right? The idea here is that, if we use a lot of mass, if you use a lot of materials, for sure that is going to deal with the huge forces of storm surges or tsunamis or whatever's coming your way. It's going to be able to deal with that. But if we build this, that also means that animals can actually not migrate to the land anymore. It means also that we do not really have free access to the beach anymore. And if we have real estate property there, especially for building walls, this is totally reducing the value of our intervention. So what I propose, and I've shown this before, are these inflatable storm barriers, right? So what is this really? This is a very thin-walled pressure vessel. It's actually a membrane that is pressurized from the inside. The idea here is that we are not using mass, but we are using form, and this form is allowed to deflect with the storm surge, as long as this form doesn't break, as long as the water doesn't go over, and as long as the waves don't really resonate, because these are very lightweight structures, as long as the waves don't resonate with the structure, this could be an attractive alternative to the current approach, which is just using lots of rocks, lots of concrete, or lots of bricks to use. So we've been studying, it's nice to show a rendering, but we've been studying these barriers. So the idea is that, and you see on the right-hand side a structural cross-section. So these barriers would be, when there is no storm surge, which is actually most of the time, they would be buried in a big caisson, for example, under the boardwalk, so you wouldn't even know that they are there. When the storm surge warming comes out, these can be inflated, and this has already been done in the Netherlands. They have used this not so much for storm surges, but just to control the level between two water bodies. And this technology has been used actually at a much more smaller scale for dam technology. What is new here is the scale of the storm surge barrier, as well as the magnitude of the forces that it has to interact with. So we looked at, we did a case study for such a barrier that would be positioned in the Jamaica Bay, Rockaway area. And we looked at different levels of water that we had taken from, historic data that we had taken from the Sandy storm. And we found that these kind of structures, they don't break, the water doesn't go over it, and there is no resonance problem. So in order to do these kind of studies, we need to make other structure interaction models. The challenging part here is that, as these things deform, as these big balloons deform, the loading on them also changes. So there's really like a constant interaction between the two. But what we were finding is that in our initial analysis is that, indeed, if you just inflate the form, it becomes a semicircle. If we have loading on the one side, the crest will displace, and we will start seeing eventually some inversion of the membrane, which we don't really want, because we want the pressure in the membrane to always keep this membrane taut. And this is a typical shape that you would see if you have water on the one side and on the other side. We also started looking at the use of corrugations and whether that might be useful, but actually that led to a lot of slackening of the membrane. And then I also had the good fortune of working with some people at Ghent University in Belgium in their wave-loom tank to look at experiments of how these models would interact with the waves. And again, we didn't really see any resonance in those models. Okay, so a question that I get asked very quickly is, okay, what kind of material is this? And if it gets punctured, does the whole thing not go down? So this material actually already exists, right? So there are these rubbers, which are like 1 inch to 2 inches thick. They actually consist of a number of layers, which you see there in the middle. But the part that is really there for the strength is the middle layer, right? Which are the nylon fabrics that is very strong, that has a very high high Young's modulus. On the outside we have a rubber, and often, I have not shown that in here, but often there are ceramic chips embedded in that layer as well. This is to stop the debris, because the debris is really the thing that would make these, if these things get punctured, then that is a problem. So the ceramic chips are not going to stop the puncturing, but actually it's going to make sure that when it gets punctured, that it doesn't tear through. The other thing is that I imagine these storm surge barriers to be compartmentalized, or maybe even have two layers, so that if one layer gets punctured or one compartment gets punctured, then there will be another compartment that can kind of take over. And that's actually also what we do when we design steel glass floors. We don't just design one steel plate. Actually, we have two glass floors. We don't design one glass plate. We actually have 2 or 3 glass plates with a transparent sticker that you don't see, so that if one glass plate breaks, there's the other ones that are actually taking it over and keeps the pieces in part. So we were looking at, so actually this membrane is quite thick, right? So people then started asking, oh, is this really a membrane, or is this more acting as a shell? And so we developed many parametric studies to investigate whether for these kind of situations better to use a membrane or a shell element. So we investigated, what if we change the thickness versus the radius versus the internal pressure versus the shape. And basically what we found is that if your membrane is quite thin or thin enough, it will act as a membrane. Also, when it's highly pressurized or stressed, it will act as a membrane, and we have no point load. So what you see here are studies that we did. So the graphs on the left-hand side, all the ones in red are the ones that are indicating where we mostly get membrane as opposed to bending action. And so that's when the membrane is thin, when it's highly pressurized and you have no point loads. And then the other thing that we had noticed in existing finite element analysis is wrinkling of membranes. Is a very complicated thing to incorporate in a finite element model. So we developed a conic programming approach which allowed us to incorporate all these different kind of situations, because the membrane can either be taut, which means it's stressed in 2 directions. It could be wrinkled, which means it's stressed in one direction but not in the other direction, or it could be slack, which is really bad, is when it's not stressed in both directions. Okay, so I've come kind of to the end of my talk. I have in this talk only talked about forms that adapt to their environment, or forms that can change to changes in the climate, which I thought was relevant for this forum, but I also have work on rigid structures and how they can take earthquake loading, or how we can construct without building any scaffolding. But all my research really focused about using mechanics and form to come up with new designs for engineering that have applications in the built environment, and hopefully for a more resilient and future-oriented future. So what we do is we study the interaction between structural surfaces, whether there are membranes, grid shells, nets, and the environment. That can either be very literally earthquake loading, storm surge loading. I'm also interested in tsunami loading, but it can also mean solar radiation or temperature changes. I'm interested in new systems. As I mentioned before, in my domain, construction industry is a very conservative discipline, and mostly, the design philosophy has been we design things that don't change their shape, that don't deflect, and we use materials that have been around for a very long time. So I'm interested in looking at new innovative systems that maybe I've shown you examples of where we draw our inspiration from biology, but I also have work where we look at practices in craft or in history and see whether there are construction techniques there that we can use for applications today. And then in order to do all that work, we have to develop methods to study that. So we use numerical methods, machine learning, graphical methods, and analytical approaches to study all these different things. And of course, I don't actually do all this work. These are the people in my lab, and some of the funding bodies. These are the people that work in my lab every day to advance this work. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Well, let me maybe put this one Shall we both go sit there? Shall I go sit there?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'll switch this off. Yeah.
Under the extreme events and changing environment. So I have a few questions here to ask, and then we can have questions from the audience, both online and in person. So for online audience, please type your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to there soon. First, I really was fascinated about wind engineering. That extreme wind acting on structures, the force is really determined by not only the wind itself, but the form of the structure. So today's topic comes back a lot of using the form rather than the mass to achieve the flow of the force, and also even have large deformation of structures as an advantage of achieving the flow of the force. So I'm wondering, in terms of the wind aerodynamic force, if we have large changes of forms, basically the force distribution will be changed. If that happens quite often over the change of the environmental conditions, then would that be posing really a challenge for determining the aerodynamic forces?
Yeah, I think that's a number of questions you're asking. I'm actually very happy to be in the panel because you already are offices are next to each other. I think indeed for aerodynamics, one is like it's really fascinating how we can actually use the form of, let's say, a tall building, but the same goes for a bridge, to what they call confuse the flow, right? So it seems that the more protrusions that you have, the more angles that you have on a building, it's actually better to reduce the loading of the wind on the building. And actually, that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, like how do these wind loads change with time? I think that's a question about climate change. So, for example, this was a huge question when they were building the Burj Khalifa. So, this is might not be today anymore, but SOM was building the tallest building, Burj Khalifa, at heights that had never been seen before. And the question was not only what are the forces up there at such a height. So they actually had to do a lot of physical experiment to determine what are the wind speeds at such a height. They've never built at such a height before, especially not in that region. But also to predict we can see what are the loads today, but what are the loads going to be tomorrow? Or what are they going to be in 20 years or 50 years? And actually, that's also some of your research, right? Like predicting how, as a function of climate change, the loads are going to change. And this is really, I think, for our profession, civil engineering, a really, really important question, because when I was a student, you were given the loads in the codes, and there was not really any, at least when I was a student, not really any mention of climate change, of how these loads might change. But this is now really a big, big challenge for civil engineering. The loads that we are designing for, whether it's wind loads, the storm surge loading, all this is changing. And I think the way that we build one is the codes have to adjust with that. And I think, there are methodologies and practices that are put into place. The design approach of traditional structures is being changed. But I think the larger question is maybe the structures or the systems that we were designing when the loads were not really changing. I think we should ask ourselves, are those still the structural systems that we should be changing? For example, with the storm surge barriers, right? So the lifespan of these rubbers is about 25 years, and you might say, well, that's not very good because, then we have to replace the membrane. But actually, it might be really good because, we could actually adjust the design of these structures and update them for what are the predictions for maybe the next 25 years. But so that is really, I think, a way of thinking that has not really, gone into mainstream thinking in civil and architectural engineering. I think at the moment we are adjusting laws, but not so much, we're not so much taking a step back and thinking that, okay, the things that we are designing, are they still really the ones that we should continue to design and build, or are there maybe other systems that adjust, that can adjust their, and hence the title of the talk, that can adjust their mechanical response as a function of the loads that are changing with time, and that are that are not so predictable. But that's more your realm, right? Like, yeah.
So just following that comment on the climate change, I think the big challenge with climate change is our prediction for far future is very uncertain. So right now, if we build very strong structures for the end of the century, what could be very too conservative could be if you cover the whole range of uncertainty. So there's a lot of thinking about adaptive pathways. So I think the structure you're discussing about adaptive to the environment that's currently changing day and night and so on. But do you also think about the structures could be adapting in the long term, meaning this structure could be changed or added over time if our environmental is getting worse and worse,
right.
So that we don't need to build them super strong now, but over time they could be adaptable to the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think some of your research is about that as well. Like, how do we, because I think traditionally we've built like, okay, let's look at the next 50 years, let's look at the next 100 years, and then look at the loads, let's look at the materials, and indeed build something that is going to last, survive all the events that are going to happen in the next 100 years. But if we can reassess every time what the current situation is, or what the situation is going to be in the next 50 years, that I think would be really, really helpful. And the storm surge barriers could be that, right? Like you could adjust the pressure, you could adjust the thickness, so many things could be adjusted. But of course, this would, in this particular case, mean replacement of the entire membrane. But there's also, I can imagine structures that could be added on, or that could be changed. And actually that is something that I have not brought up, but like the idea of the circular economy, where basically you have systems that are made out of parts, but actually these parts could be taken away and reassembled in another way that is maybe stronger or maybe more adapt as serving a particular purpose. That could also be, I think, an interesting approach.
I think we need to take a question from the audience.
I have a technical question about the sharp barrier. Don't the waves mostly come perpendicular to the coast, and therefore the motion is in the third dimension?
No, no. So they're in the wave break zone. That's where you get these drift currents. So actually, most of the waves are coming like in the plane of the plane's not, because it does move in 3 dimensions, but they're mostly coming like this because you have there the.
So you're able to do this in 2D with the third dimension?
Yes. Here, but we've also done 3D. I mean, I was showing the 2D studies, but we've also done 3D studies. Yeah.
I take a question from the online. So there's a question, what structural issues does one run into when considering ambitious shear structure, such as the ones created by Philip Bloch?
Oh, all right, okay. So the question here is about, I think, vaulted structures. So these are compression structures. And the question was, what are the structural issues?
What structural issues does one run into when constructing ambitious shear structures, such as the one created by Philip Bloch?
I think So the question is about a little bit about the type of structures that I've shown you in the beginning, which are grid shell structures, but you can also have vaulted structures that are continuous, right? They could be made out of stones or they could be made out of concrete. And so a lot of the work that Philippe Bloch is doing is made out of stones that are then you need to. So there are some challenges, I guess, with shell structures, the construction of that, and I think I've touched upon that a little bit. That is their construction process, and actually there has been a paper, shell structures, they are very efficient structures because they work mostly in membrane action. They were so high days in the 60s. I mean, we might all remember like the airport designed by Saringen. There were beautiful like shell structures in the 60s and the 70s, but then all of a sudden they were not built anymore. Some people said, well, it's because architects don't like these curved shapes anymore. But the main reason was really because in order to construct them, you have to, it's very expensive. They say that the construction of shell structures, during the construction, the formwork is 40% of the entire cost of the project. So I have been working on techniques on how we can actually still construct shell structures which are very efficient in their material use, but not use any formwork, right? Because the formwork is, well, first of all, very costly, and there have been advances in how we can do the formwork, but also it's not only economically very costly, it is also environmentally very costly. So I think if we want to build some of these efficient structures, they require, first of all, a much higher level of craftsmanship, and secondly, I think the way that we have to think about them is like, how can we construct them without having to first construct the formwork and then the structure itself. But I think Philippe is also working on that, on how we can construct. You've seen in the intro slides, like the construction industry is so wasteful during the life of the building, but also in the construction itself. And so different people are working on different aspects, right? Like also, for example, the concrete, as you know, our colleague Claire White is working on much better concrete. So there's different approaches to that. And shell structures are shell structures, membrane structures, net structures, grid shell structures. They're all super efficient, so we need to use very little material. Ideal, these are all shapes that we see in nature, so it has kind of been proven by nature that these are all really good systems. We just need to find ways to either make them out of materials that are very sustainable and also have construction practices that are really not wasteful.
Maybe one more question from the audience?
No.
So, this silly question, when I was thinking about the movable facade, how is that different from a curtain inside? Right, one's inside, one's outside, and what would the relative advantage to building it in be?
Yeah, so actually the curtain is a really good example. I don't really, so the curtain, let's see, I think the curtain controls lighting levels and maybe to an extent can also control temperature, right, if you have a really thick curtain. So, and you could also say, okay, what's the difference with, for example, Venetian blinds, right? But actually we have, for example, we haven't done a comparison with curtains, but we have done comparison with Venetian blinds, and because these shading devices have so many more degrees of freedom, we can have them in so many more positions, whereas, for example, the curtain is, well, half closed or completely closed or whatever. But with these smaller units and with the range of motion that you have, you can actually much more control the amount of lighting or the amount of solar radiation, as well as the view that you want to have out. Because this was actually very fascinating that, if you want this to be a product that's going to be marketable, that people are going to want to install on the facade, okay, you might have all the building energy operation savings that you want. If people cannot look outside or control their view outside, they don't want that technology, right? So I think it's kind of interesting that as engineers, often we kind of optimize things so much, and then eventually people don't want to adopt that product because it's not the right color or because it doesn't allow us a view, right? And for that, I think it's very important that we design and do research with humans in mind, right? Because if we want to make a change, we can think about all the changes we want to make, but if people do not really want to adopt them because it doesn't really suit their lifestyle, they will not adopt these technologies.
I have a question here from online. Would your engineering approach be relevant for building outside of our planet?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That is actually, in my domain of research, like the new thing, like how are we going to build on the moon, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you might say, okay, that's crazy research, right? But actually, it poses good questions, like what if you have to build, for example, with the materials? We're not going to transport wood and bricks and concrete to the moon or to another planet, but what if we have to work with the local materials? How can we do that? How can we do that without having a construction crew of 100 or 2, or many people there? How can we do this with robots? So yes, so all of these, I think the use of form as opposed to a lot of material works really well. If you want to construct on another planet, and then also the use of robotics works really well. So I think often people see robotics as maybe in competition with labor, but actually there are many circumstances, extreme environments, dangerous environments where robots can really do the work that we do not want humans to do for safety reasons. Right? There you are.
So, well, thank you, Sigrid. Thank you, Nin, for leading the discussion. And I want to thank you all for coming to our final faculty seminar of the semester. But I can, stand 6 feet here. But there is one more seminar that we are going to be, we're co-sponsoring with Civil Environmental Engineering, with the Metropolis Initiative in the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences program. This Thursday afternoon, Marshall Shepard from the University of Georgia is joining us to give a presentation on the sort of the future, considering both the environment and this sort of equity in society. So please join us, and looking forward to seeing you there. And look forward for the announcement of next semester's faculty seminars coming soon. And thank you all, and see you again soon.